Hello, everyone. This is Rochelle Scouten, Development Director with the NBDA. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to have Caron Whitaker with us this morning from the League of American Bicyclists. Please take it away.
All right, thanks, Rochelle. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Caron Whitaker. I do government relations at the League of American Bicyclists. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is sort of what we've been learning through this COVID-19 and how we're using that to influence the transportation policy that we're working on. So first, I just want to give a quick update on the stimulus bill that's happening hopefully this week. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing with local advocacy organizations, and then switch to federal policy and talk about the emergency release, the stimulus funding, and the goal of a long-term transportation bill or reauthorization. So first, this next bill that's hopefully will happen this week, it sounds like they have a deal. It's will increase funding for the payroll protection program to another $320 billion. And then the small business administration loans, the EIDL loans, there's another 50 to 60 billion in for that, some aids for hospital, and then ramping up the testing. Like the Senate is voting today, hopefully. The House may or may not have to have members come back, but hopefully they'll do that, and then the president will sign it by the end of this week. But this is just one more bill in the process, and we expect another emergency relief bill in late May or June. And I know there's a ton of resources out there for you. NBDA has a page, People for Bikes has a page. We've been working at it from the nonprofit side. But if you're having any questions about how to access it, any trouble accessing, also consider checking in with your member of Congress and your representative's district office. They have basically customer service people, they call it constituent service representatives, whose job it is to just help you negotiate through federal programs. So it's good to know they're out there, and it's also a way just to help build a relationship and have them know that there are bike businesses in their district. So there's a website, you can actually just Google, find your representative, put in your zip code, and you'll get their name. On their website, look for the contact button that will generally have the offices. Now, they all have a DC office. They also have an office in the district. For something like this, I think it's really important to call the district office and build that relationship there as a local business, and just say, you know, I'm an owner of a local bike shop, I manage a local bike shop, and we're having some trouble, whether it's with the payroll protection program or the compensation for employees' sick days, or whatever it is. Just know that that's another resource, and it's their job to help you with this kind of thing. And if they're good at their job, they'll call you back and they'll keep you informed about how things are changing, and any suggestions to help with your specific issue. It's also good to call them if you're going after any of these funds and you haven't gotten them, because there is another bill coming, and if this tranche of money is still not enough, it's good for your representative to know that there's small businesses in their district still needing funds or still needing help in some way. Okay. So then I wanted to talk about some local advocacy work and some work we've been doing to support them. We've all also been working with People for Bikes on keeping bike shops as essential. I know People for Bikes really reached out to the governors and worked that way. What we did is created template letters, did email blasts, that sort of thing, working with state and local organizations to make that happen. And also working with Homeland Security to get that into the national list of essential businesses. And with local advocates, we thought they were asking for a couple of things. Yes, they want bike shops to be essential. Another piece was getting bicycles as a necessary supply. And the third thing we've been pushing for is to ensure that biking and walking are allowable at safe distances. And one great example is Bike Walk Minnesota worked with the governor's office there, got all three of these things in their order. And then this tweet came out, I think it was Friday, where in Minnesota, they've seen biking and walking up 72% statewide. So really, we really want to make sure people have an opportunity to get out there biking and walking. Some of the other things we do at the League is that we are working with the local advocacy groups and surveying them about best practices. What arguments worked? What would you do next time? One of the things we're working on now is open streets. So if cities are opening roads, closing them to cars, opening them for biking and walking, what have they learned for the process? I'll say one of the things we've learned is that we really need to push out sort of trail etiquette, because those roads often become more like an open street event or a bike trail, less a great place if you're going out there for a training ride or something like that. And I also realized I forgot to put a slide in this, but I do want to mention that May is Bike Month. We're still celebrating it as Bike Month, except for we're going to move Bike to Work Day till September. But in terms of Bike Month, we are connecting it to the fact that May is also Mental Health Month, and the need for exercise for mental health and the benefit that biking can play for people. The other thing that we're getting contacted about a bit and hearing from our state and local advocates about is that we're getting a lot of people who haven't been on a bike for 20 years, or they're like, this is a good time to teach their kid how to ride. And people are a little rusty and they're looking for education opportunities and things. So we have a set of videos on this. Again, we have the Share the Trail, because that's one of the things that we're hearing about and pushing out also as open streets. How do you put a helmet on? Make sure it's right for especially for kids. We're getting a lot of questions like that. We know our local advocacy groups are doing that. They're finding that when they do webinars on things like how to change a tire, the ABC kind of things, making sure your bike is ready, they're getting a lot of hits on that. So that's something we're seeing. I've attached a handout to this webinar, and the idea of that is a flyer that if you're at a shop where people aren't allowed in, they're waiting outside, or even if they're waiting inside, it would just give some of the links to these videos and other education pieces, finding out where they can ride, where there's trails. We're getting a lot of interest in that information, so we thought we'd offer that. It's also worth contacting your local advocacy organization. They may have something like that as well. And then finally, the other thing we're getting a big push for are our Smart Cycling Quick Guides. They're like 3 inches by 6 inches, just pictures of basic, what kind of lights do you need? How should you lock up your bike? What trail etiquette, riding on sidewalks, that kind of thing. And one thing we do offer is to co-brand. So we sell them for $1 a piece for under 50, and then it's cheaper going forward. But if that's something you're interested in, we would love to help get these out, because we're getting a lot of requests for this basic kind of information. And we can't do our education classes, which is where we would usually point people. The other thing we're seeing is really this new interest in wanting more places to bike and walk. And we're hearing it from our regular members, and the picture on the bottom here is in I think it was Missouri, where the places are closing parks because it's just too hard to get out there and bike and walk while social distancing. And I also just really like this tweet from Dan Rather, because we're hearing this message more and more from sort of the unsuspecting partners. So I want to now switch and talk about how we're using that in our federal policy. So a couple of things. One, the transportation bill right now, we're at the very end of a 5-year bill. So Congress had already been working on that before this happened. But now that we're in this stage of COVID-19, we had already been thinking about what were the big major changes we wanted to make, but now we're trying to think through it in 3 different stages. The first is emergency relief, which is what we've been talking about now. So things like unemployment and hospitals, but also aid to cities, and how can people get around now, especially if they were people that relied on transit. The second is stimulus, where it's generally about job creation. And then the third is recovery, which at the federal level, we're thinking about reauthorization, the next transportation bill, where the long-term policy changes we want to make. So I'm going to first talk about emergency relief. I've got kind of a timeline here. This is how Congress is thinking about it. But of course, all of this depends on the virus, how much it's spreading, and when and how communities open. So when we're thinking about emergency relief at the state and local level, we're thinking a lot about the essential businesses and opening up spaces for biking and walking. Sometimes that's the open streets, sometimes it's just creating temporary bike lanes. And so as part of that, we're looking at ways to help cities and communities build that temporary infrastructure. We're looking for things like to limit the design requirements that maybe the state or the federal government has now, looking at loosening some of the permitting process, including some of the environmental processes, but only on sort of paved roads, paved surfaces. We have seen things in the past where a city wanted to put in a number of protected bike lanes, put in 10 different protected bike lanes, and had to do 10 different environmental studies, including looking at how it was going to affect the traffic flow. Things like that just really aren't necessary right now. There's not the traffic flow. They're temporary, and it's on a paved surface. And we're also looking for support for transit. We've been working well with transit. Transit just got a big chunk of money in the last bill because they're trying to keep their people employed. They're trying to keep their buses and trains clean for people who have to take it. But transit is also asking people not to take transit. And so they're really interested in I know they've been reaching out to bike share companies, but we're also been working with them to talk about how can we switch some of those those shorter trips to biking and walking, and always that first mile, last mile issue of how are people going to get to transit and get back. So, what we're seeing now in terms of that temporary infrastructure are things like this, where people are just putting cones up to widen the sidewalk. Maybe they're taking out parking, making the parking the bike lane, and the bike lane more sidewalk. These are both from Brookline in Massachusetts. But when we're talking about sort of pop-up or temporary bike lanes, we're also talking about things like this that actually have some separation and some sturdiness. The things that we were looking at in Brookline, that doesn't take permitting. The city can just do that. But we'd like to see more things like this that have a little more permanency and also will be easier to translate into permanent infrastructure in the future. So that's what we're looking at in emergency relief. The League has been working with Lyft on a letter that we'll be sending to Congress. Hopefully next week we're getting some other national groups to sign on to, and I can share that with you even this week once the letter is formatted as we're getting interest. But a lot of the local government groups are really interested in this. It includes some of transit interests, so we're really trying to work together to build that larger constituency for improving access to safe access to biking and to walking moving forward. So when we're talking about stimulus, again, this is really about job creation. And during the last stimulus bill, I just want to step back a second and talk about what happened in 2009 and how we were able to secure some funding for biking, and then how that's changed, how that is changing moving forward. So in 2009, Congress did include $27 billion for transportation, but as they were debating that and getting ready, they were really focused on shovel-ready projects. They wanted to get projects out the door that could start people working within months. And at the time, there was a real backlash against any of that funding going to bicycling or walking infrastructure because they didn't see it as a priority. They weren't sure that there were actual shovel-ready projects, and they weren't sure that they would create the jobs that were necessary. The bike community worked together. At that point, there was a national coalition called America Bikes, where we funded a report that looked at job creation in 10 cities, comparing road projects to biking projects, to sidewalks, to multi-use projects. And it was actually the bike projects that created the most jobs per $1 million. And that report out there, we also created a list of the shovel-ready biking and walking projects. And it worked, and as a result, 3% of that $27 billion was set aside for local priorities, of which the vast majority went to biking and walking improvements. And so we had the best year for new infrastructure being built in 2010, followed closely by 2011. And we're just trying to get back up to that now with regular funding streams. So, but this year, and this is some good news that came out of this. This was looking at the funds that were used for transportation out of the American Recovery Act. This was done by ASTRA, so it was done by the Association of State DOTs. We saw that greenways, sidewalks, and bicycle facilities were creating 17 jobs per $1 million, far more than any of the other road uses. And so we have the report that just looked at the cities, but this is a national report. So now we have 2 reports showing that biking and walking creates more jobs than regular road projects. So the goal for the stimulus is again to ensure that some of that funding is available for biking and walking. Hopefully some of it is set aside in the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is where most of the biking and walking funds come from. We also, when we look at those policy changes in terms of giving cities some flexibility to do temporary projects, we'd like to see that. We'd like to see a study on those projects and hopefully some effort making them permanent. And so the strategy for that, one thing that was also learned from the stimulus is that a lot of the money, because they were looking for shovel-ready projects and projects that could be done right away, a lot of the funds went to things like repaving roads. Sometimes that is very necessary and it is a priority, but some of those projects were done just because they could be done and they could be done fast. And so now Congress is really, they want to know how shovel-ready a project is, but they're also want to know what are the safety benefits for this? How does this create networks and improve connectivity? what are the equity concerns? Is this going to create new transportation options in an under-resourced community? Things like that. So we're, again, the national groups are talking actually tomorrow with the goal of having a strategy over the stimulus in general, but also specifically on a list to get that kind of thing. And I just want to point out, in general, the mood in Congress is more open to biking and biking projects. I'll talk about that in a minute. But in 2017 and 2018, Congress passed an additional $20 billion for transportation infrastructure, but they put language in it specifically saying it should not go to transportation alternatives. And they actually did it in 2 different places. So there is still some of that feeling that biking and walking is not a priority, maybe not as necessary. So that's one of the things we're looking to change. Again, the bike community is getting together. We're going to work on a list again, but specifically we want to look at things that are in state and local plans that show a definite connection to safety and improving access and connectivity, but also trying to harness some of the interest that we're seeing in biking now, that you're seeing in your shops. And also that feeling from folks out there biking that, hey, this isn't adequate. We need something better. And also to continue this relationship with transit advocates of, we want to become a partner now. We want to help lighten the load on transit now, but with the goal of creating sort of multimodal networks in the future, make it easier to bike to transit and then from transit to your destination. Oops. So then just wanted to talk about recovery and what we're looking at for reauthorization and moving forward. So from the League's perspective, we're really trying to get to some systematic changes in the transportation system, things that will rebalance the uses of our streets, make bicycling safe and safer, I should say, and increase that connectivity. And also talk about trails to complete streets. So how can we build trails in between communities? Trails, we're seeing a lot of the urban, big urban cities, New York, DC, Portland, Seattle, Philadelphia, trying to create or putting in trails within the city that then connect to complete streets, street infrastructure there. So we're looking at options to do that, and we're looking to do it through the reauthorization of the transportation bill. The current transportation bill runs out September 30th of this year. And before COVID-19 shut us all down, or shut Congress down for the most part, Congress was really working towards a new 5-year bill. And the biggest concern they had then was, how are we going to find funding to pay for what we need? And now we're sort of in this interesting situation where Congress knows it needs to spend money to create jobs, to keep communities afloat. And we're hoping that there's a way that we can connect those things. And obviously our allies in Congress are working on that right now. So just a quick reminder of how of what needs to happen for transportation bill to become a bill. First, it starts at the committee process. It's a separate process in the Senate from the House, where in the Senate 4 committees have to write a bill, combine them all, and take it to the Senate floor in the full Senate votes. The House, it's 2 committees. One writes all the process, all the policy, the other one has to find the money, and then they combine it into a bill and they vote on the House floor. At which point, once it passes both the House and the Senate floor, they're 2 different bills. So they create what's called a conference committee, where you got members of the Senate, members of the House working together to come up with a compromise bill. And then once they do, that bill has to go back, get voted on by the Senate and the House, and then the president signs it. that whole, so the conference committee is the big piece there, and that's where that can take some time. Once it passes conference committee, it usually just flows really quickly. Right now, the only part of that that's been done is in the Senate. They've written the highway and roads piece, but I will say that's also the biggest piece, and it's always the hardest to get done. On the House side, the Highways and Transit part of the bill, the Transportation Committee, is very, very close to having that bill done. And so we're looking forward to see that. So I want to talk a little bit about what did pass in that Senate transportation bill, because it was really good for biking and walking. These were some of the things that the League was really focused on. Transportation Alternatives is the program that more than 50% of all the funds that go to biking and walking infrastructure come out of Transportation Alternatives. And we got a 40% increase in funding in that. We got more local control to make it easier for communities to get the projects on the ground quicker, and some other really good policy changes. In terms of safety funding for biking and walking, right now, bicyclists and pedestrians make up 20% of fatalities, but get less than 1% of safety funding. This bill would set aside funding. So if you are in a state that has a high percentage of fatalities that are bicyclists and pedestrians, or if you are in a rural planning area, or if you are in a metropolitan planning area, and your area has a higher than average rate of biking and walking fatalities, then there would be specific money just to address those problems in those areas. We thought that was a big win. We got some better planning to make it easier for communities to model, like, hey, if we build a biking and walking bridge over this main highway, how many people will now have access to jobs and services on the other side? Got some funding for using bikes post natural disaster in terms of, both pre and post, to get people to get out there, let people know there's an evacuation happening and how to get out, but also afterwards to go find where people are, see if they need help, bring a power source so they can charge up their phones. This would also include money for first responders and community organizations to learn, safe biking with electric bikes, with cargo bikes, and then train on how to use them and to buy the bikes. One thing we're still working on is a federal land set aside to put some money aside for building bike facilities, bike lanes, trails, bike parking, all of those things in federal lands, mostly National Park Service, but other areas as well. We're working with People for Bikes on that, and we're hoping to get something like that into the House bill. And then the last one is automated vehicles. It's not really relevant to the transportation bill, but we're just trying to make sure that, or to the highways part of the bill, that automated vehicles are tested to make sure that they can detect and respond to people biking, to make it safer. So in the transportation bill, we got all those things. What that means, so over 5 years, we got an additional $4 billion increase into transportation alternatives, of which 98% of those dollars go to biking and walking. So we went from 850 million a year to 1.2 billion in the first year, and then it will increase with inflation for the next 5 years. We also got that roughly $1 billion for biking and walking safety. There were a couple of others really interesting things in there. It was the first transportation bill ever to have a climate section. So that was, we talked about that resiliency funds. There's a picture on your bottom right of people using bikes after Superstorm Sandy to get supplies out. So it's for things like that. There's funding for urban areas for congestion. There's funding for everywhere to reduce emissions and air pollution. and work on that resiliency. All of that we think will help with biking and walking. There's also some funds for what's called the Community Connection Program. So the picture on the bottom left, this was a highway that was built in Baltimore that was built in between a community. So it sort of separated neighbors from neighbors, and it's just not used. So this program provides money for communities to plan and then get rid of the highway and rebuild it as community. And the way that they are testing or proving that the new plan would connect the community is whether or not there'd be biking and walking access to get across. And then there's more funding eligibility for biking and walking education. So overall, we were really happy with that Senate bill. And the really good news is that we think the House bill will be even better. The picture is the Transportation Committee Chairman, Peter DeFazio. He's from Oregon, the Eugene area. He's the former bike mechanic. We used to say he's the only former bike mechanic in Congress. Over the last 10 years, I haven't checked to see if there's any other bike mechanics in Congress, but he definitely has a soft spot for biking, bikes himself, and has, is really hoping to have his bill out soon. And he has been clear that it will have a strong emphasis on improving biking and walking, both, meeting what the Senate did in terms of increased funding for building infrastructure, but also looking at building biking and walking networks, looking at biking and walking safety, and improving on the climate work that was in the Senate bill. So for us, in our interests, we would love to see the transportation bill happen this year. And that's for a lot of reasons. One is that every time there's an election, we get to a new Congress. So in that new Congress, all the bills that are being worked on now, they expire. So if we get to January 2021, they haven't written a new bill, that Senate bill expires. And we can't be sure, we'll work as hard as we can, but we can't be sure that the next bill will be as good as this one, because that Senate bill, it's a Republican Senate, and the committee chair is term limited, so he won't be there next year. And while he's very supportive of his own bill, some of the Republicans in the House feel like he went too far on things like biking and walking. So we'd really like to keep that Senate bill. But they're on this time limit. And as I showed you before, there's still a lot of work. There's still that normal process, takes a committee process. Congress does not have a format to do it online. They still really like the idea, or want to hold the tradition of meeting in person and the discussions in person. There's been a lot of push for them to change, but they have a really, even before, mid-March when COVID-19 came on, they were on a tight timeline, but now they've lost a month, and they're probably going to lose another month and maybe more. So we're hoping that they'll find some willingness to work outside of the normal process, but it's a 5-year bill, so that's a hard thing to do. But we are really pushing for that. Mr. DeFazio is pushing for that. The Senate Chairman, Mr. Barrasso from Wyoming, is pushing for that. So we're hoping there's some interest to really make that happen. And the reason they're pushing for it is not just because they want it to be their bills that pass, although that is a big piece of it. If you remember, I said that the biggest hurdle for getting a transportation bill is finding the funding to get it done. And that has been, since I've been doing this job, which is over 10 years, that has been the biggest issue, because right now the gas tax doesn't bring in enough money to fund all the infrastructure projects we need, whether it's biking and walking, whether it's bridges, whether it's transit systems. And so there's been this huge reluctance to increase the gas tax, and that is still there. But they need to find a solution to it, because the gas tax goes into something called the Highway Trust Fund, which is like a bank account for transportation. So our gas taxes go into the account, and then that can only be used for transportation. That account is going to hit zero. Well, it was projected to hit zero in October, when we were still thinking we were getting gas funds, gas taxes. And now that those gas taxes are drying up, it might even hit sooner. So Congress is going to have to do something soon on funding. Right now, because of this disaster, Congress is willing to deficit spend. And so the real hope is that we can use some of this deficit spending to go into that long-term transportation bill, so that it will continue to create jobs and still do the work that a stimulus bill should do, keeping cities afloat, keeping people working, providing essential services, but can be done now. Because the real concern is that when we get into the next Congress and they have to restart writing the bill, by the time they finish, there's going to be no appetite to deficit spend again, because we're digging a pretty big hole right now in terms of deficit. It's necessary to keep the economy up, but it's going to be a hard hole to fill in the future. So the idea of doing that more is going to be difficult. The idea of raising taxes in the future, when our economy is still pulling itself out of this, or may have just pulled itself out of this, is also going to be difficult. So there's a huge race in Congress to figure out, or from the transportation folks, how do we make a bill happen? And from the outside, we're also thinking about, how can we help? How can we do that? So the goal, again, is to get that stimulus funding to help fund that long-term transportation bill. There's also been a lot of talk about, can we switch from the gas tax to a vehicle miles traveled tax or something else? All of that takes more study. So if we could get a transportation bill funded now, it could include getting those studies done, so the next time we're up against the wall, we actually have a funding solution. Excuse me. We also, as I said, we want to use this current bill because from a biking perspective, they're really good on biking and walking. And then the other thought is that there were some changes in the Senate bill to transportation alternatives to safety that we know that the House Transportation Committee agrees to. And so one of the thoughts is, can we keep talking about those changes and get them into a stimulus bill, even a bill that comes before this long-term reauthorization? So that would be, there's changes to give cities technical assistance to design the best biking and walking projects they can do, give local governments more authority to get projects on the ground, and of course, just funding. So I already talked about this, that starting in 2021, both bills expire, leadership changes, we have to start from the beginning again. We'd like to avoid that. So our strategy for that is that we're going to talk about some of those longer term goals, talk about better safety, talk about reducing congestion, reducing emissions, about the need for more local control and letting local governments get projects on the ground. And one of the strategies that we're thinking about and planning for is, how do we engage some of these new and returning bicyclists to these efforts, to these people who, pulled their bike out of the garage after 10 years and are thinking, hey, this is really fun. I want to do more of this, but I don't know where I can go safely, or where can I take my family for a ride once people are driving again? And so that's some of our strategy. We're pushing on Congress, talking with people in Congress about what our goals are for the long term, to try to get that both into a short-term stimulus and really push this long-term bill forward. But also we want to try to capture these folks that getting on the bike for the first time in a long time, or maybe getting on the bike for the first time. to both keep them biking, keep them enjoying it, but also help us create safer environments for biking. So a couple of things you can do as you're talking to folks who are new to biking, they've got all those questions, connect them to their local advocacy organization. You can connect them to us. And as part of that, share some of that education materials. So on the top of the page, that's a picture of the flyer that we've connected to the webinar. That, if you're interested, consider taping that up to your windows. So when people are waiting outside to get their bikes, they can see, oh, we can get more, we can watch these videos, we can get some tips and resources on how to bike safely. I'm really interested in that. So that kind of thing, maybe your local organization has something, connect with them, find out. It's also worth connecting with your local advocacy organization about what they're talking about or what resources they have to connect your customers with them. I also mentioned at the beginning that your congressional office, your representative, is a good resource for helping you access federal funds. That is a great opportunity to reach out to them. They want to know your experiences. They want to make your experiences better. And it's a way to sort of start that relationship with them. And so in the future, if there is a stronger advocacy ask, if there's something that you're interested in doing, you can do that. But it's also, they may be looking to tour local businesses, and that may be an option for you to have them in your store and to talk about what you're doing. And that hopefully can help both sides. We also would love to have you get involved with the League. We have that flyer. You can join our League e-news, get updates on what we're working on. Consider, if you're interested, we have action alerts too. You can send those out, share those. And then we have this Connect Locally map on our site where someone can put in their zip code. This is my zip code in DC, so there's a lot going on here, but they can find bike shops, they can find clubs, they can find advocacy organizations, they can find bicycle-friendly businesses that are supportive of people biking and walking. When there's events, the events can be there as well. So, or if they're looking to take an education class, they can do that. They can find certified instructors on that. So we'd love to work with you more, and would love to hear from you on what you're hearing, what you're learning from customers, especially what has changed during this time of COVID-19, and how we can work together. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and I can take any questions.
People can type in questions. I don't see any right now. We can give them just a minute here.
Okay. Or I'd love to know if you're hearing from new cyclists or returning cyclists, how COVID-19 has changed what they're thinking about biking, or concerns they might have, things they'd like to see changed, any of that.
I don't see any questions coming through here. If they do have questions and they want to contact you, can they email you?
Yes, absolutely. There's my email.
Perfect.
Would love to hear. We're also, if you're wondering what's going on with advocacy, either with the e-news, we can help you with that. Or like I said, we're having regular meetings with state and local advocates. We can share what they're learning about doing open streets projects, keeping biking and walking open, any of the kinds of things that they're doing.
Great. Well, thank you for being here with us. Thank everybody that is on. Thank you to everybody who is on this webinar this morning. Thanks for joining us at the NBDA with the Bike League. If you're not a member of the NBDA, go to nbda.com. We would love to have you. And we will call it right there. Thanks again.
Right, thank you.